there is no right or wrong in birth, in labor, in any of these things at all. Like, it's not like you have to have a natural birth and that is the only way to do it. And that's kind of the mentality that I absorbed going into my first labor. And I was like, yeah, if anything goes wrong, if I end up with Pitocin or anything, the labor is a failure. And I think I really, really pushed myself in that labor to not receive pain medications and to not receive any interventions and to want to do it on my own with no support and with nothing but me, but myself. And it all worked out for the best, but at the same time, I wish my past self then would have known that it was okay. Like, it's okay if you have to get Pitocin. It's okay if anything happens, if you do end up with a C-section, any of those things, it's okay. But I think that was a big learning for me as a doula, is to understand how very okay it actually is. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Coffee Witching Hour. My name is Lacey, and this is my podcast that's all about yoga, birth, and raising kind humans. And today, this episode is a bit of a celebration, and it's a bit of a reflection on my journey as a doula so far. So, as I said, this podcast is about those three things. It's about my work as a yoga teacher, my work as a birth doula and birth worker more generally, and being a mom. And one of those three elements of what my life is right now is just kind of ending. So I just was doula to my very last client who gave birth earlier this week. And it's going to be the very last client that I take on before I begin my PhD in the fall. And I think I should probably do an entire episode just on what motivated me to go back to school and what I'm going to be doing in my PhD. But we'll set that aside for now and come back to it in a future episode. But for now, I just want to focus on the birth aspect of all of this and my experience being a doula both in California and here in St. Louis, because it's all ending now and it's really bittersweet. So I'm going to dive into some of my reflections, some of the lessons learned as a doula, some of the things that I'm going to miss a lot. And I am really excited to start talking about this. And especially if you are a doula or someone who is interested in birth, just a mom, someone who has given birth themselves or plan to give birth in the future, this could be really beneficial to you. So I hope you enjoy it, and we're going to dive straight into it. So I started working as a doula. Really, the journey began even before we moved to California. Really, the journey began when I was pregnant with Aira during the pandemic. I signed up for a prenatal yoga teacher training program, which was 85 hours. And the person who led the training, this was Bridget, and this was with Rooted Prenatal Yoga in Boston. And the person who led this training was a doula before she moved into her prenatal yoga work. And so she had a lot of experience working as a doula in New York, and a lot of her insight and reflections came from that perspective. So what we learned in this 85-hour training was not just about yoga. That was just it was an element, of course, it was an element of the program, and focusing on how to prepare the body for birth with yoga, with movement, with those kinds of things was obviously a big element, but she really wove a lot of her experience and knowledge as a doula into the training as well. So we got a lot of information on the medical side of things, and it was just a very well-rounded training. And that's where I learned kind of the difference between midwifery care and obstetric care, which, if you're not familiar with that, obstetric care is kind of the default where most women who are going to give birth end up in. And midwifery care, you kind of have to seek it out and be a little bit more intentional on getting a midwife over an OB, but it's kind of the more holistic type of care and is mainly for low risk people. But if you start with midwifery care and something ends up happening that makes your pregnancy higher risk, for example, with me, developing gestational hypertension at the end. Typically the midwives stay with you even if you are transferred to somewhere else besides the birth center or places or are working with an OB as well. But yeah, so this prenatal yoga teacher training is where I learned about the role of doulas. It's where I learned about midwifery care. It's what motivated me to switch out of obstetric care and into the birth center, which was just a much, much more fulfilling experience, I think. Even though with the OB I was with before, there was nothing that really bothered me that I could put my finger on. It was just little comments, little things along the way, little things like, oh, I don't know if you can handle the pain of being in labor and things like that. Little things that kind of undermined my confidence in being able to give birth a little bit. But that's what motivated me to switch into the birth center, into midwifery care, and got me really interested in what a doula does and what they can bring to the birth. And I didn't have a doula for this first birth because it happened during the pandemic and we could barely even have one partner in the room, let alone a doula. There were some virtual doulas, but I don't know. I didn't want to be talking to a computer screen while I was in labor. So I did not have a doula for my birth, but there was a nurse, I think she was a nurse who was part of the birth, who kind of acted a little bit like a doula. Once the night shift came on, she was there with me continuously, and she really, really gave me all of those words of affirmation that I needed to know that I was doing the right thing and my body knew what to do and all of those things. And she was just extremely caring to both me and to Daniel. She showed him how to pour water on me in the tub. She drew me this beautiful bath. It wasn't that beautiful, it was just a bath, but for some reason looking back on it in my mind, it just feels like a very beautiful moment. So she drew me this beautiful bath and set up the room just so neatly and beautifully. It felt like there were little fairies in the air, and she was kind of a fairy godmother. But the whole doula-like nature of her, the way that she was just this very kind, compassionate human, I don't even know her name anymore, but if you're out there and you know that you were at my birth, thank you so much for being the grandmother doula in the room. But that was one of the big things that really showed me that, wow, having someone there who is able to listen and to hold space and to see you in that moment and to just provide you with support in whatever way is needed. Someone who has seen birth before and who just intuitively knows what you're going through and knows that you can do it. That was so helpful in my birth to Aira that after that I was just like, I've got to become a doula too. Not because I thought I could be that yet. I mean, I had only given birth once. That was the first birth that I had witnessed. So I didn't feel anywhere close to being as knowledgeable as that grandmother figure in my birth, but I thought that I had learned a lot just from this experience with giving birth to Aira, and I did dive really, really deep into all of the books that I read to prepare for the birth, all of the prenatal yoga teacher training, and all of the resources that I just devoured during this training, the documentaries and the everything. It just became such a big part of my life and such a passion project during the pandemic when everything was on lockdown, just preparing myself, my body, my mind, my spirit for labor, that I felt like I actually had learned something and I did have something valuable to share. Now, my perspective was one of someone who was extremely afraid of birth, but mostly I was afraid of the interventions. So mostly I was afraid of getting an epidural because I had seen, back when I thought I was going to become a doctor, I was shadowing some gynecological surgeries. One of those surgeries that I shadowed, I saw someone got a spinal block and I passed out. I didn't even see it coming. I was just watching the needle in the spine, and then all of a sudden it got really woozy and just passed out, hit my head on the edge of this metal table, busted my eyebrow open, got a possible concussion, all of those things, needed stitches, all of that. So I had this experience with not an epidural, but a spinal block, which is similar, with seeing one that was just so traumatic that I was afraid, very afraid of getting an epidural myself, because I'm like, well, what if I faint during labor? Like, I mean, obviously now I know, like, if you're in a hospital, you're going to be taken care of. But I was just afraid of that cascade of interventions. I didn't want to end up with a C-section. I didn't want to end up like with a bunch of IV fluids pumped through me. I didn't want to end up like swollen and having trouble with breastfeeding and having a traumatic experience that I would have to go back and process. And I didn't want that partly because the literature that I read some of it was very fear-based, and some of it was very much like, this is what you want to avoid. These things could happen. You could have a uterine rupture. You could die. All of these things. And these books are framed this way for a reason, because there are actual consequences that can happen when you do have that cascade of interventions. Bad things happen in birth. That is completely possible. But at the same time, what I know now as a doula is that if you have a few of these interventions, 99.999% chance that you are not going to die. And that was what I was really afraid of going into birth. I was afraid that I was going to die in labor because, the literature that I read just told me that if I end up with anything, something bad was going to happen. So that was a big fear of mine going into birth, and that was a big learning for me as a doula, that when I saw these births and when I saw these interventions, they actually weren't as scary as some of the literature that I read kind of made them out to be. And that there is no right or wrong in birth, in labor, in any of these things at all. Like, it's not like you have to have a natural birth and that is the only way to do it. And that's kind of the mentality that I absorbed going into my first labor. And I was like, yeah, if anything goes wrong, if I end up with Pitocin or anything, the labor is a failure. And I think I really, really pushed myself in that labor to not receive pain medications and to not receive any interventions and to want to do it on my own with no support and with nothing but myself. And it all worked out for the best. But at the same time, I wish my past self then would have known that it was okay. Like, it's okay if you have to get Pitocin. It's okay if anything happens, if you do end up with a C-section, any of those things, it's okay. But I think that was a big learning for me as a doula, is to understand how very okay it actually is. So anyways, let me backtrack a little bit. So I had my birth. I decided to sign up for doula training. It was still pandemic time. I got a job as a contact tracer with Partners in Health, which was a little bit of a dream job and a little bit of, I felt like I was working a little bit over a minimum wage job, like doing telephone calls. So a little bit of a combination of both, because I absolutely loved Paul Farmer, still love his work, but absolutely loved Paul Farmer. And he was a big pioneer, founder of Partners in Health, and he was still kind of present tangentially in the organization. So feeling like I was doing this big important work for Paul Farmer was big for me. And so I had this job with Partners in Health, and they were very generous, I felt, about taking paid time off. And even though this was a flexible work from home job, not so flexible as in you had to be on the clock certain hours and you had to be tracking what you were doing and all of this. There was a lot of tracking going on, but it did give you I felt generous paid time off to be able to do, what are you going to do during the pandemic? We weren't going out and seeing friends or anything. So I did do my doula training with paid time off with Partners in Health. So in a way, Partners in Health actually funded my doula training. So I did my doula training. I did a DONA international training, and it was okay. It was inspiring. I did learn a lot. It was, I think, 3 days, I think, of a very intensive around the clock being on the computer type of virtual intensive schedule, which I was used to because I was finishing up my RYT 500 too. So I was doing a lot of these modules, also using the paid time off with partners and health to finish up my RYT 500 with Laughing Lotus in New York. But yeah, the Doula International training left me feeling a bit unprepared, I would say. Unprepared and, I don't know, inspired, because I knew in my heart that this was something that I was going to pursue. And I think I had doubts before going into the training. But after finishing the training, I'm like, wow, like I know this is something I'm going to use in my life. Not just for me if I give birth again, but I know that this is actually going to be part of my business, and this is going to be part of what I am offering to the world, because I have something valuable to offer. Having this master's in global health from Harvard School of Public Health, and having done research in maternal health and worked in public health and all of this, and with my prenatal yoga teacher training background, it just fit. It just made sense. All of that, and I felt like completely like, where do I even begin? So it took until we were moving into California for me to actually integrate this into my offerings and to actually be able to say with confidence, I am a doula. I think until then it was just me doing a lot of readings and learning and really getting familiar with the theory behind the material until we made that move. So I let the material sit with me for a little bit, and I'm really glad that it did, because I feel like it had a chance to settle, and I had a chance to reflect and to think about why I wanted to be a doula, why I wanted to offer these things, and what I knew, what my gaps in learning still were. And then when we moved to California, all I did was I joined a Facebook group that was it was for doulas in the Bay Area, and I don't even remember. I think I replied to a few comments for people from different organizations looking to add some doulas to their organizations, basically. These were all, they weren't like employee businesses. They were more, one of them was a collective and the other was more of just a website that featured different doulas local to the area. So I reached out to both of them, made connections, had some phone calls with them, and it went really well. And they were like, yeah, you're going to be a great doula even if you haven't been to a birth yet. We think you have something good to offer. And so these two women out in the Bay Area, two separate women, two separate organizations, they were the ones who helped me to find my first births. The first one that I went to, I actually have not shared this experience publicly yet, because it was one that was like a really big learning for me. So the first birth that I went to, I did feel prepared, like knowledge-wise, textbook-wise, and even before the birth, I was rereading my Doula International manuals and going over the material and all of those things, and felt like I knew my stuff. And if I were going to be quizzed, if the person in labor was to say, hey, multiple choice, A, B, or C, which is it? I think I would have been like, yeah, it's B, and would have gotten the quiz completely right. But birth doesn't work like that. And I kind of knew that in the back of my mind. And I kind of knew that I would have to actually get the experience before I felt confident going into a birth. But at the same time, I was like, well, I don't have any experience besides my own birth, so I'm just gonna cram these textbooks, these manuals before I go. The birth itself was one that if I were in the same position again, I probably most likely would not have accepted this client. Because, well, what happened is the husband reached out to me through one of the doula agencies. So it was like a website where your name is up and they have your contact information so they can contact you directly. So the husband reached out to me, and all of the communication, 100% of it was through the husband. And he was looking for a doula a little bit last minute. It was Christmas time. We were there because we had to be at the farm for farm duties. So we were there over the holidays, and at first I was going to say no because her due date was in like a week, 2 weeks. It was a pretty short timeline, and I was going to say no because I'm like, how are we going to do this? But then I talked to Daniel, who is always fueling my adventurous ideas. So he was like, yeah, go for it. It's, you know, good money, good experience, go for it. So I said yes. We had one phone call, all three of us, with the husband, the wife, and myself. And I don't think the wife said a word the entire time. It was all the husband speaking. And I was like, I mean, I had never done this before, so I don't know really how this is supposed to work. I don't know if they really knew either, but what I know now is you never do all of the communication with the husband. Like, the person giving birth is so important, and understanding that person and understanding what their preferences and needs and fears and all of those things are the things that make you successful as a doula and make the birth a better experience for the client. So I didn't know all of that at the time, and I don't know, I just kind of let the husband take the reins and talk to me, and yeah, he didn't want to do any of the prenatal visits, which is another red flag, because the prenatal visits are the thing where you get to know the client and you build that relationship, because just going into a birth as a complete stranger is less impactful than if you know the person and have already developed that relationship. And I had heard that before, but I guess I had to experience it myself. So when it was an induction, so when she was induced, I had only had that one call with the three of them and had never even spoken to the wife really before. And even at the hospital, all of the communication was with the husband. The wife was scared, terrified, I would say, terrified. This was even her second baby, but she was terrified, which, no judgment, birth is scary. I get it. If you're scared on your second baby, I was too. But she was terrified, and I just felt kind of like a deer in headlights, and I didn't know how to comfort her, and she also kind of closed herself off to me a little bit. And I would suggest things like, you know, we can try this breath work, or I can try bringing out some music or tea lights or things like that. And everything I brought up, she was like, no, I don't want it. And so there was a lot of resistance, and there was a lot of also positioning my role as almost like a waitress. I don't know. It's kind of like more of like a service industry role than like as what a doula is, which is being someone who's there and kind and compassionate and all of that. But the way she kind of talked to me was a little bit bossy, and a little bit like, give me my water, give me my, like, braid my hair, and like things like that. And so it was a little bit not the ideal relationship with a client I would have wanted. That, and now reflecting on it, I kind of realized this a few weeks after this birth happened. And maybe this is just my mental scripts and all of that. Maybe this is all in my head, but I think she thought I was flirting with her husband. And I think that was a big reason why she disliked me. And once I realized that after the birth, I felt so bad, because that was the last thing that I wanted for someone in labor. Like, I would hate that if a random doula came in, or a nurse came in, or something, some stranger came in and was just flirting with my husband while I was in labor, which is one of the most important days of a woman's life. I would have hated that. And so if that's what she thought, which there is a very good chance, I would have hoped not to behave as hostile as she was to me, but I would have felt something for sure. But they say in doula training, comfort the partner as well, and, be there to support not just the birthing person, but the partner. And since the birthing person seemed like she was not wanting my advice or not wanting to talk to me, I did spend a long time talking to the partner and, asking him. He was nervous too. He was nervous too about becoming a dad. So I did spend a long time talking to him and getting to know him and all of those things while we were waiting for things to happen in the induction. And so after all of this happened, I got an email from her a week later. This is honestly the first time that she spoke to me directly, besides like get my water, braid my hair. And she was like, she basically said, you made too much small talk with my husband, like, and you need to go back and do additional doula training. And I was so heartbroken after all of that. I offered a refund because I just felt so terrible, which they didn't accept. But I just was like, how did this happen? Am I terrible? Was I flirting with the husband? I didn't mean to. Anyways, it was this whole thing. And I responded very apologetically, offered the refund, which they didn't accept, and felt like I just got myself into such a mess, and didn't realize until that point that being a doula, you can actually be part of the trauma, even if you want to do everything in your power to make birth less traumatic and to make it warmer and more welcoming to the baby and all of those things, to make it a calm and peaceful place. You can actually play a role in the trauma that happens in birth. And so after that happened, I cried. I was like beside myself for a night. Felt like a horrible person felt like a horrible person. But I really took it to heart and was like, okay, I thought I knew a lot, but obviously I'm very inexperienced being a doula. And the comment about me needing to do additional training, I think is valid, because all I did was that quick DONA International training and felt like I knew nothing after all of that. So I really took it to heart and signed up for a postpartum doula training through DONA International. But then after that, I still felt like I knew nothing, which the postpartum training I thought was actually a lot more informative. And I felt like I walked away from it being like a little bit more confident in what I knew. Even just having seen a birth before at that point, just felt more confident in my knowledge and my ability and all of that. But still was like, I need to know more about birth itself. I still don't know what I'm doing. And so I signed up to do Cornerstone Doulas trainings, which they are an amazing organization. They were once based in the Bay Area. I think they're more based in Portland, Oregon now, but a lot of the doulas in the Bay Area, especially some of them in the collective I was working with, had trained with Cornerstone, and it was highly recommended. And they just take this amazing social justice lens to things and are looking at all the inequities and all of the experiences, and are not like natural birth is the way to go, but are like, this is the range of experiences people have. And one of the founders is a home birth midwife, so they do have this holistic mindset to giving birth and all of that, but are supportive of all different types of birth. And I did their birth doula training, postpartum training, and full spectrum training, which full spectrum teaches you how to deal with abortion, death, all of these things. So anything along the life course, how to be a compassionate, kind, caring human in the process of any of these big life transitions. And it was just an amazing, phenomenal training. I did this over the course. Their material was very extensive, and it was a go at your own pace, and there were in-person optional modules, but they're always optional and they're always recorded. So they're very flexible about how people are learning, because they're just so inclusive of different types of learners, and it's phenomenal. And so I did this over the course of, I started in the spring when we were in California, continued about up until when Ezio was born in September. So I did all of those materials, all of that learning over a pretty long time frame. And then even last year, I went back to Cornerstone, to their online space, and did a childbirth education training, because I'm just like, Their information was so good. And every time I do a training with them, I learn more and more and more. And so if you're looking for a birth doula training, one that is more than just a weekend long and one that really, really dives deep into birth and intersects with public health and social justice and all of those things, I highly recommend Cornerstone. Nikki and Julie, the founders, are just amazing to learn from. And yeah, it's an incredible training. So I learned with them and just learned so much and became pregnant with Ezio. And that was a big learning experience too. I don't want to say I became pregnant to be a better doula, but I will say that was part of the motivation. You're gonna think I'm crazy, but I did get pregnant at the end of this postpartum doula training that I took in January, and these were not separate events. I was in the middle of this postpartum, when he was conceived, I was in the middle of this postpartum doula training, and the flowers were blooming because it's California, even though it's January, but the daffodils were blooming and it felt like spring, and I just had all of this energy, and I was just like, yeah, I'm ready for another baby. I'm ready to take my learning to the next level. Don't laugh at me, don't judge me, you're going to. But yes, that's what happened. And Ezio, me being pregnant with Ezio came as a surprise to Daniel, but I'm like, how is this a surprise? Anyways, so that was all part of the learning as well. In the meantime, I also took on more births, all of these births. Most of these births I got through the collective that I worked with in California. The second birth that I took on as a team, as a doula team with a doula who had been around a little bit longer, had been working in the Bay Area for a while and kind of knew her stuff. And it was also a traumatic birth. This was actually more of a traumatic birth than the first one, even though there was the little soap opera happening in that first one. Than the second one, it was more of an actual traumatic birth. It was more of the cascade of interventions, starting with an induction, cascade of interventions, 3 days later ended in a C-section. And that was just awful for me to watch as a doula, especially so early on into my career. That's actually the only time that's happened as a doula, and that's what I had read about so many times. But that's the only time that has happened to me as a doula. Everything else has ended in something other than a C-section, has ended in vaginal birth, vaginal delivery. This is the only one that has ended in a C-section for me. But it was just awful to watch, and I felt responsible in some ways. Like, the induction was completely unnecessary. She went in before she was ready, before the baby was ready, for just a completely stupid reason, for the baby being too big. When the baby was born, he was 7 pounds, which is not too big at all. And they just kept telling her pelvis was too small. These are two of the big lies that providers might tell you, that your baby is too big. Well, ultrasounds can be very inaccurate in estimating the actual size of baby, and that your pelvis is too small, which is just not true unless you actually have some kind of had some kind of growth restriction, which doesn't really happen in the United States. And there was a lot of fat shaming. Like, they were telling her she was going to be, because her baby was too big and because she was on the bigger side, she was going to have to get into different positions, and there was going to be a shoulder dystocia and all of this stuff and blah, 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 blah. All of this fear-based information that was given by the doctors, who the doctors were nice. The doctors were so kind too. But when you heard the words that were coming out of their mouths, it's just partly the medical culture and partly the protocols and all of that. But I'm also felt like my role as a doula was to be there and to advocate in a way that I didn't know how at that time, and I didn't want to contradict what I was hearing. And it only took until, it was only after the birth, processing all of that, that I was like, oh, that was fat shaming. Oh, that's what happened. Oh, maybe this is where I could have stepped in and talked to the birthing person a little bit more in the background, not causing drama with the providers, obviously, but given her more information in the background so that she could have made a more informed decision, because what she was hearing was just the providers' opinions on their wanting to get the baby out because they thought it might be too big for them to comfortably deliver vaginally. And so this was, she wasn't ready. Her body wasn't ready. Baby wasn't ready to come out. Ended in a C-section 3 days later. And the way I did inductions at that time for those first 2 births was I was there continuously. And I was on a doula team for this one, thank goodness, but we tried to be there continuously from the very beginning. Eventually, we had a call with the person who owned the collective, and she told us to go home. She told us, no, this is not how you should do inductions. Here's what you should do next time, which I've done every time since then, which is check in at the beginning and then give them space, because inductions can be 4-day-long ordeals, and you're gonna be a mess by the end of those 4 days if you don't go home and take care of yourself. Like, there's no hospital bed for the doula to sleep in. And 4 days of a continuous birth is just so unnecessarily intense. So what she said was check in at the beginning, go home until active labor starts around 5 centimeters, or when they feel like they need you there, show up again, and then be there to support through the birth. Because think about it, if someone was not induced, you would show up when they feel like they need you there, when they feel like labor is active and picking up and they want that extra support. Inductions just take so much longer that you just can't be there continuously. And that's what I really learned from this birth, working on this team, and both of us not knowing that, and both of us not realizing until after the birth, and neither of us ultimately being present when that C-section ended up happening, because it was a surprise to the client and they like rushed her in and made it seem like an urgent thing, when in reality her water had just broken 24 hours earlier. So they had planned the C-section hours and hours and hours ago. That's another thing I didn't realize. And I just felt so awful that neither of us were present for that C-section, even though we had been there days and days and days in advance and trying to do whatever we could in our power to be there, to be supportive, even though that early on in the induction, there's not much that you can do. So my first and my second birth that I went to were huge, huge, huge learning experiences, massive for me. The third, the fourth, the fifth, all of those births that followed, I felt like I started to get into much more of a rhythm. And although I was still nervous going into that third and even the fourth birth, I felt like I had more to share. And I felt like what I was telling them was not just based off of my own knowledge and my own natural labor and all of that, but it was based off of also what I had seen and what I knew about the medical system and what I had known, what I knew about that same hospital, that Stanford campus, I don't remember the name, but that hospital on Stanford campus that I did a lot of those births at, because I was becoming more familiar and starting to recognize the nurses and feeling that I kind of knew the environment a little bit better. When I got to St. Louis, after I gave birth to Ezio, I waited for about 6 months before I integrated doula work, birth work back into my practice. And yeah, during that time, I was mostly on maternity leave, but I had been finishing up my trainings with Cornerstone, so learned a lot, had my own second birth experience, which was an induction. So many of the births that I've been part of have been inductions because that's so common these days. And once I got my practice up and running again, I also started teaching prenatal yoga around the same time. And once I got my practice up and running again, I decided to be a little bit more specific on the type of client that I was looking for. Because in California, I would take anyone. And especially with that first birth experience, felt like I didn't know the client, she didn't know me. We didn't know each other going into it. We probably wouldn't have picked each other if we had known each other a little bit better. And so I think I was a lot more transparent with these interview calls about who I was looking for, always someone who's interested in yoga. If you're not going to be interested in yoga, then a lot of what I have to offer is not going to help, because a lot of my work as a doula and my offering is based in my experience as a yoga teacher. So I kind of position myself as a yoga teacher first and a birth doula second, and weaving those two things in together. And the clients that I found were phenomenal. They were amazing. They were people who I actually felt like I was friends with at the end of the process, and felt like I could go out and talk to and share a relationship with that's just deeper than just being present at the birth, but like I actually knew them, and they actually knew a part of me. And so I think being more transparent about who I am and what I have to offer, and linking to my social media and everything, and just showing people, and this is a big part of the advice that Cornerstone gave you, but just showing people who you truly are so they know what they're getting. If you're not comfortable with a coffee witch being at your birth, then you're not going to hire me. If you're like, oh, that's a cool Instagram name, and I'm fine with witchiness and like a hippie mentality and like all of those kinds of things, like breath work at birth, tea lights, affirmation cards, yeah, sign me up. Then those people who were all about those things, I felt like I meshed with so much better, and was able to share what I knew and tell them my experience, and give them those words of affirmation, and give them the vibe and everything along the way that I felt like I could offer as a doula. And so it was a much better fit in St. Louis than the clients. Not all of the clients, because some of the clients I worked with in California were wonderful. Even that traumatic birth, like the client was wonderful. But there were a couple of clients in there who I was like, this probably isn't a good fit. We probably should have gotten to know each other a little bit better, especially that first one. And so I think with that transparency, and with just being upfront about who I am in that one interview before they sign up to work with me, I have had so much of a better experience. And then working in the yoga studio as well, being a prenatal yoga teacher, I've just been a part of birth in a different way. And I love that I've seen people in prenatal yoga who are also my birth doula clients. And then I've had like people who are my prenatal yoga student who hire me as a birth doula, or not a birth doula, but as a postpartum doula. And then students who have hired me from prenatal yoga as a private yoga teacher, and then also do postpartum doula work. And then the continuity of prenatal yoga to a lot of people then move into baby and me yoga after they give birth. And then birth doula clients who then come into baby and me yoga, and then eventually start coming to my flow and restore classes once they've got their lives a little bit more settled. And so that continuity of knowing someone not only for the birth, but for this longer period of time is like, these are my actual friends now. Like, these are people who I'm actually in relationship with, and it's not just an isolated event. And that part has been so wonderful and so fulfilling, and the connections I've made along the way, and the connections that I've seen along the way as well. So connecting people who are doula clients of mine, and like hosting a party for Ava and having a lot of people who I've met, like my own doula for my birth with Ezio, and postpartum doula client, and former like baby and me client, and things like that, and just like getting them to meet and interact and know each other and create a community. Really, that has been so fulfilling to me. The other thing that I think is like that I'm really going to miss from the births is how wild and unpredictable and all of that. Now, I will say that even though I feel like it's been a much better fit in St. Louis, there's always birth trauma. There's always. Even if you think it's a beautiful birth, there are some things that still need to be processed, because it is a big experience in life and you cannot predict anything along the way. So there's always going to be birth trauma with no matter what birth there is. There is never a textbook birth. There's never that picture perfect birth that's just like the client is glowing afterward and like, oh, like there's always going to be something. There's always going to be something. And so I think that was one of the things that I was not prepared for as a doula. Like, I think that was a big learning for me as well, that the stories that come up, there's always going to be something. There's always going to be something. It's not going to be a walk in the park ever. And just being prepared to brave the wilderness of birth, and just being open to anything in the wide spectrum of possibilities that could happen, once I realized that, I think I became a better doula as well. So one thing that I will miss about the births is the wilderness of it. I mean, the trauma is, I wish there were a way to just wish away the trauma, but the wilderness of it, if that makes sense, like the possibilities and the beauty in seeing life emerge, like seeing a baby start to breathe and cry, and just that transformation, that transition is so beautiful, and getting to be a part of that is such an honor, and it's such an intimate thing, and I think I really will miss that. The other thing is most births happen in the middle of the night or close to sunrise, and I mean, I'm someone who, if it were up to me and if no one was dragging me out of bed, I would probably be asleep at 9 p.m. every night and would sleep in until like 7 if I had it my way. And so being like bust out of this shell and being able to like go out at midnight, and like sometimes I like have felt like I'm clubbing, going out with my bags of doula stuff and my kombucha and all of that. It's felt like a weird kind of clubbing where I'm like, yeah, all showered and prepared, and I wouldn't say dressed up cute, definitely not, but am prepared for an adventure to happen. And then after birth happens, walking away around sunrise and just feeling like there has been a story here. Something big has happened, something has shifted, even if it's just one birth. That feeling is so beautiful. And that feeling of just seeing the sunrise and being out in the world when everything is so quiet. I mean, I guess I could do that outside of birth, but what motivation do I have to wake up before sunrise every morning? I really can't motivate myself unless I'm like traveling or at a birth. But being out at sunrise and feeling the world so quiet, and just having had this experience of being part of a baby coming into the world, that is what I'm going to miss a lot. Now, I will say, not all parts of my birth work are going to be gone permanently. I am still going to be teaching prenatal yoga and baby and me yoga at Urban Breath. Most likely going to still be teaching Flow and Restore. So that's 3 classes that I'm going to be offering weekly. The baby and me and prenatal are a class series. So I'm still going to be there in some part of birth work, even if I'm not going to be at the births anymore. And even with my PhD, I'm still going to try to weave maternal health into this French language and literature PhD program, into the dissertation research. And so it's still going to be there. And everything I've learned, even if I'm not going to be a birth doula anymore, everything that I have learned is going to be present, and it's such a big part of me. So thank you so much for listening to all of this. And this is the ending of my birth doula career, at least for now. Maybe I'll pick it up at some point again, but it is the ending for now. It's a pause. I've learned a lot, and I hope you've learned something from listening to this episode as well. If you have thoughts, if you have comments, if you have reflections, if you're a doula or thinking of becoming a doula especially, and if you have questions for me, please reach out. If you're a prenatal yoga teacher or want to become one and want to know more, please reach out. I love to hear from you, and I love to be a mentor and support others. So please reach out, and I want to hear from you. Before I go, let me know if there are topics that you want to hear more about. Let me know if there are episodes you want me to dive into, and subscribe, support, do all of those things, and I'll see you next time.